jokes. Jokes in the sense of, I think what is so mysterious for me about jokes, did you notice a strange feature about jokes, which is that first they are, of course, the idiosyncrasy, creativity of language. But at the same time they are totally objectified in the sense that it's count against the nature of jokes to say, now I will produce or invent a joke. A joke is somehow always already here. You say, did you hear that joke? You tell jokes. I mean, you know what I mean? Jokes just pop up out of nowhere. You know the famous, this man looks X like an idiot. This man looks and acts as if he believes that this film is
I was thinking we'd start with the canyons and then loop back chronologically.
Absolutely.
So is it true that you approached Bret Easton Ellis to start the canyons? Is that what the first inception point of?
Well, what happened was that we were going to do a film called Bait. A kind of a shark movie in Puerto Rico with Anton Yelchin and Emmy Rossum, and with Spanish money. And that money collapsed with the problems of the euro about 5 weeks before we were supposed to start. And so I sent Bret an email, which is in fact on our Facebook page, and basically, you know, telling him what had happened, and then just saying, you know, why don't we just do something? You know, what you do, and it was not that expensive, you know. You know, good-looking people doing bad things in nice rooms, and you write something, I'll direct it, we'll pay for it. And we don't have to deal with censorship or any of this, don't have to deal with permissions, don't have to have an A-list of actors, we just make it. And that's how it started. And you know, we were both at a place where we were feeling kind of frustrated by the new economics of movie making, in which, you know, the kind of films that we were interested in were being marginalized as commercial ventures. And so we said, you know, why don't we just jump into this new world? And so it was written as a micro budget. And that's a different thing than having a regular film, which then you recalibrate as a no budget film. Everything about the film in terms of the locations, the dialogue, the action, you know, it was written for places we knew where we could work free, you know, the Chateau Marmont, stuff like that. So it was designed to cost nothing.
Were there any challenges with that budget, or were there also things that you found it pushed you?
Well, I mean, once you just basically say we don't pay,
yeah,
then, you know, it clears the decks in many ways. You know, you pay you can pay minimum wage, so that's about $100 a day, and we only pay that during shooting, not during prep. And so, you know, people say, you know, permits and all this stuff, we don't pay. You know? And that's that. And it's fine with us if you know, you're not in our movie or not working with us, but we can't, you know. And so it's a kind of, it's a real freedom. And you know, as I said to someone when we were casting, and you know, and there was some question whether we should cast James Dean from the adult world and whether we should cast Lindsay with all of her history of unreliability. And I said, look, you know, we're putting our money in this. If you can't take a chance with your own money, when can you take a chance? You know, I mean, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? We're going to lose our money. It's not even that much. And so, yes, it was freeing in that way.
Were there any like aesthetic choices you made that you otherwise wouldn't have done?
Well, virtually all of them.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I mean, you know, when you're not paying for locations, and somebody says, you know, you can shoot here, but you've got to pay us. Say, but no, we're not going to shoot there. Well, that's an aesthetic choice.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and when the cars in the film happen to be the cars that are owned by your crew members, well, that's an aesthetic choice too. Fortunately, James owned an $80,000 sports car, so that worked out. And the gaffer had a Mercedes, you know, so we used that. So yes, those are all aesthetic choices, and you do have to get lucky. The main location was a house that we got through Kickstarter, which was filled with museum quality mid-century modern furniture. You know, you look at the film and you say, you know, the huge production design budget, you know, because that's all real stuff in there. It's not cheap stuff. But that just happened to be the house.
Were you happy with the Kickstarter experience? Is it something you would do again?
Yeah, in fact, I'm so happy with it, I probably won't do it again. Because as time goes on, I'm realizing more and more how lucky we got. We got lucky with James and with Lindsay and with the shooting and the quality of the film, of the location, and that, you know, were we to do it again, you know, odds are we wouldn't be so lucky. You know, it's like walking into a casino the first time and putting $10,000 on red and winning. And then the stupidest thing you can do at that point is bet again. Because you are never, ever going to get that $10,000 back if you keep betting. So the temptation for me is say, hey, you know, we won on the first spin of the wheel, let's walk away.
Was Bret happy with it? I mean, he's pretty vocal about...
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, he can be ornery. And, but I think he really is happy with it, you know. He thinks the movie is too much me, and I think it's too much him. So I guess that's a fair distribution of credit.
Yeah, because he mentioned in that New York Times article that it's a Paul Schrader film.
Yeah.
And it seems like, well...
And I look at it, I say, this is really a Bret film. This is the most Bret film I've ever seen.
And yet there is a relationship with some of your other films, like the comparison's been made to American Gigolo, and I'm wondering how you approach this as a...
Well, I mean, certainly Gigolo was not on my mind when we began, because Gigolo was a lot of production design, a lot of expense and sets and all of that, and, you know, and we were shooting in locations, you know, without permits. But the locations started falling in, and I started seeing the movie, and as I saw it, I kept seeing the stuff from Gigolo, and I realized that about several days in that I was basically going back to that style to the extent that I could. Now it is a walk and talk movie, which is, in order to do the film at that budget, it's dialogue heavy, mostly just people in rooms talking. That's the cheapest thing you can do when you make a movie, is have people talk. So people talk, and then they walk, they drive around, you play some music, and then they talk again. So when you're doing a dialogue-driven film, you know, it limits the amount of fancy footwork you can do with the camera when they're seated. If you can get them up on their feet, you can do a little bit more.
Now, you've taken chances with your actors on this one. You've taken them in the past. How do you feel the performances kind of added up in this one with James and Lindsay? And
well, I mean, I think, you know, we got very lucky. I mean, I didn't. You know, we didn't really set out to cast either of them. Lindsay was sort of a joke, that when somebody, sort of a joke about her doing a cameo. The producer's friends with her manager and sent the script over. Lindsay read the script and said, I don't want to do a cameo, I want to do a lead. And all of a sudden that started to change. And, we said to her, well, you have to do your own hair and makeup, your own wardrobe, provide, your own transportation. We'll give you free lunch, that's about it. And she became a 25% partner in the film, and she will be reimbursed quite handsomely. And then Bret had this weird thing with James. I thought it was all a joke, when he started mentioning James. And he had known James through his adult work, not personally. But he did tweet. He said, I'm sort of basing this character I'm writing on the male porn star James Dean. And sure enough, James Dean tweeted back, said, I can't wait to read it. So Bret and James had lunch, and James is quite impressive in person. A substantial guy, not a flake, smart and funny. Both his parents teach at Caltech.
Oh.
One is literally a rocket scientist, and the other is a cancer scientist. So he's a smart kid, good Jewish boy from Pasadena. And so Bret said, well, Schrader, we'll give you a screen test. And I said, Bret, come on, really, please. This is such a joke. But, he's my partner, and I had to do it. And it just went from one thing to the next, and he was good. He was good. And then this notion, Bret has this notion of post-Empire, which is that we are now in the post-Empire phase of our art life, the same way the Brits were in the 19th century, and or in the 20th century, and that we are living off the detritus of the remains of our empire. And I thought, what better way to do a kind of post-Empire film, and the film is in fact called a post-Empire production, than to do it with somebody from the celebrity culture and somebody from the adult film culture, and then and a sort of controversial author and director, and pick up these little pieces of trash from the boneyard and put them together and make a movie out of them. And so that's when the idea of James and Lindsay really started to get traction with me, because I saw it as a kind of statement, a casting statement, rather than, so it was not only saying, we think these two people are the most interesting, but we also think we're making that kind of statement about our culture by using them.
Yeah. Well, there's like a meta-narrative, because it's about Hollywood and movie making, and it's got you've got your Robert Downey Jr. or your John Travolta figure, on the upswing. You've got your adult film star making, or like a musician trying to cross over. We're in that sense, was the New York Times article almost perfect?
Yeah, I mean, the Times article morphed. It originally began before Lindsay was involved. So it was going to be an article about new methods of film financing and filmmaking. And then Lindsay got involved, and so the new angle with the Times was the article was going to be about the new Lindsay. This will showcase her return to respectability. Well, the new Lindsay never showed up. The old Lindsay showed up when she did. And so then it became an article about the old Lindsay. Not much you could do about that. She does have a tendency to hijack things she is involved in. If we were doing an interview now with Linz and I, the entire interview would be about her, because it would be, formulated in such a way that everybody would be on pins and needles. And worry, So, when you move into her orbit, you cannot escape the gravitational pull of that narcissism.
There's a certain component, though, that you're on the vanguard of these new techniques, these new distribution techniques that maybe your peers in the 70s and 80s haven't got to that point as well. So that was a storyline too.
Well, yes. I mean, you know, it is. I mean, I really hadn't planned to go here myself. I'm 66 years old. I planned to, you know, ride into the sunset on that broken down horse of the movies. I just didn't realize that the horse was failing so fast, and that the horse wasn't even going to make it into the sunset. And that if I wanted to keep working, I would have to think about new strategies and new media. And this sort of came up. Now, a number of people of my age are fooling around in this area, but not many. There's not many that still work. And if you can still put together a decent budget film, you know, like Scorsese can, then of course that's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
If you're on the sort of cusp, like Phil Kaufman and Walter Hill, you're trying, you know, so Walter Hill puts something together with Stallone. Phil Kaufman was trying to do something like we just did, but I think he ran into trouble. I don't know if it's still on or off. And of course, if you're in your 20s and you're doing a Kickstarter operation, that's one kind of buzz. But, you know, doing it as, you know, an ARP member, you know, and I did not want this to feel like, you know, an old guy's film. It didn't feel to me like one. Bret's script didn't feel like one. I mean, I'm doing the next film I'm doing is going to be an old guy's film, the one with Nick Cage. But this was not. This was about it's a film about kids even younger than Bret. This is about the blender grinder generation, you know, of all the phone hooking up with phone apps in that world. And so I didn't think it was, you know, a film about my generation at all. It doesn't feel that way to me.
It feels like with American Gigolo, though, that you're able to suss out that that's what's happening, that's what's changing. It's how.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that credit goes to Bret.
Okay.
I mean, because he's much more plugged into that world. Yeah, and that world is plugged into him. So a guy like James Dean, he was a Bret fan. He was not a Paul Schrader fan. He didn't know who Paul Schrader was. So Bret is really kind of closer to that world than I am.
And so you're shifting gears with the Nick Cage in what ways? You said it's an older man.
Well, it's about a man looking at, you know, looking back at a life. You know, it's about an ex-CIA agent who has early onset dementia and is trying to put together some things. So it's by necessity autumnal.
Are you at the stage where you're looking back, like when you're?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty hard not to. You know, because at some point you start to wonder, you know, is this going to be my last film? And I remember when I was shooting Adam Resurrected, I walked over to the cinematographer one day and I said, you know, if this is my last film, I think it's a pretty good one. You know, because you do think that way, you know. I mean, all it takes at my age is one meeting with a doctor, and all of a sudden the doctor says to you, you know, I think you better readjust your priorities in life, sir. So, you know, it can change pretty quick.
Do you look at your kind of filmography the way that when you were starting out you were reviewing, you wrote Transcendental Style, and you were, you know, observing a full body of work for these directors?
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously you stumble through it, but you know, and not all the films I made I would make again. You know, I would not have gotten involved in that Exorcist situation if I had known what it would lead to. But by and large, the things I've done and been attracted to do have an element of provocation and originality. You know, so often I go to movies and I look at the screen and I think to myself, how did they stay awake while they were making this movie? Because they've all made this movie 10 times before. You know, they're just sitting here, you know, punching in and punching out. And I have managed to stay away from that film. Everything I've done, I was trying to shake it up in some way. We were talking earlier about this film, Jesuit, and I got involved in that film. I wrote it because I wanted to make a Latin film. I wanted to do a Spanish, you know, a Latin American film. And in the end, it got made with another director who cast the Latin roles as Anglos. But what had interested me about the film wasn't the plot, but it was the fact that I could be, you know, trying to put my sensibility into that of a Latin American.
It almost made me think of your article on Peckinpah that you wrote when you were an early critic, and that's what's interesting to me. So, transcendental style, looking back on it now, do you feel like you've made films that would fit into that?
No, and I think I've intentionally stayed away from it.
Yeah.
Those icy waters are for stronger stuff than I am, and you know, those filmmakers who can. The closest I ever came was, in a way, Light Sleeper, but it's still not. Those that kind of anti-psychological realism, it takes, you really have to commit yourself to it, and I just like realism too much. I like character. I like psychological themes too much. When you start moving into transcendental style, you move away from a lot of the building blocks of storytelling into another kind of perception.
And I guess in America, like, the films require incident, more incident than maybe the Japanese, the ozu, the Brisson.
Well, I mean, it's not America. You can make those films in America. You can make them in Mexico. You know, Carlos Regadas redid Ordet.
Yeah.
Brilliantly. No, you can make them films. What it requires is a laser-like belief that this will, you know, if you're Michael Haneke, you make that film, it's not that hard to make that choice. But if you're me, you're saying, I'm not really that guy. I can pretend to be Dreyer, I can pretend to be Bresson, I can pretend to be Michael Haneke, but I'm not really. And you know, so, yeah. So any more than I could pretend to be Renoir, I couldn't pretend to be Bresson.
When you were entering into blue collar, what was your perspective? How did you see yourself as becoming a director versus now that you have the ability to look back at what you've done?
Well, again, blue collar was something that, again, you were trying to break a mold. Had this idea of workers who would rob their own union as a kind of metaphor of self-defeatedness. And then the idea of two black guys and a white guy, which at that time was not done. And whenever I told people I want to make this film, and they would say, you mean two white guys and a black guy? I said, no, because if it's two white guys and a black guy, the black guy has to be so good that he gets boring. But if it's two black guys, I can make one of the black guys kind of worse than the other, and I can get some nice character work in there. And And so, you know, you looking back at it now, and it's not a big deal, but back then it was. I mean, it was right about the same time I had written a script for Jack Nicholson and Diana Ross. And Barry Diller at Paramount would not make an interracial movie.
Huh.
You know, he actually just said, they'll burn the theaters down if we make this movie. Now, that's not that long ago. That's 35 years ago. And you're thinking, you know, you can't cast, you know, two of the hottest, sexiest stars in the entertainment world together because they're not of the same race.
And that kind of started your, you have a career that's basically hand in hand with your actors. Like, I think every film has some story of incident with it. What were the lessons that you learned of just actually having to deal with actors for the first time based on that experience?
Well, I mean, there is no simple lesson because, you know, actors are very different. Some like honesty, some don't like honesty. Some like intimacy, some don't like intimacy. Some want to be part of the process, and some want to be instructed. And so there is no rule. You just sort of get to know the actor and their talent level and what they're good at. And you sometimes you make mistakes, and you can see it right in their eyes right away. You say, oh, you know, I shouldn't say that, you know. Yes, I'm making, you know, I'm making some progress here. And so, you know, I mean, what you need to do, obviously, is get them far enough out of their comfort zone so that they're doing something that is really interesting to them, but not so far out of their comfort zone that they're not doing work that they respect.
Yeah. Is it particularly hard when you're close to when it's a personal script, like something like Hardcore, which seems to have a lot of your own life in it?
By the time you make it, it's not personal at all anymore. I mean, it's almost, when you're writing it, it starts to feel kind of personal. But by the time you've made it, there's been so much planning and so much division of labor that it's almost like watching something up apart from yourself. You know, and occasionally when you're making it, you get all of a sudden, you get a little glimpse, a little hit of, oh, that's me, that's why I wanted to do that. But mostly it's all become this other entity. But then when it's all over, and you look back at it, and so much of what a director's personality is just rapid fire decision making. Because when you're directing, you're making decisions very, very fast all day long. And every little thing is a decision. The cup here, this here, like this. Higher register, lower register, whatever. And you're making decisions so fast that you're making them instinctively for the most part. You know, actors will point that out to you, saying, you know, you're telling me to do something that you do. You know? And then you look back at the film, at the tens of thousands of decisions that were made in a concentrated time frame. And you say, well, I guess that's who I am. That's my signature. I mean, only a fraction of these decisions were made that consciously. If you had asked me at the time, I would have told you I'm putting the camera here because of a sightline problem. But the truth is I was putting my camera there because that's where I like to put it. And I came up with the sightline problem in order to move myself over there. You know, it's just like, well, the first film I made, I realized that whenever I went to a location to set up an establishing shot, I always said, the establisher is over here. And the cinematographer was always saying, the establisher's over here. And I said, Bobby, I said, Well, he was left-handed. I was right-handed. So I'd walk over and say, okay, here's the establishing. He'd walk over to the same spot and say, no, here's the establishing. So, you know, it's that simple.
Have you noticed like a kind of aesthetic choice that comes up more often than not? I noticed that your films tend to have establishing shots that are high angle.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, certain angles you fall into. You know, a Kubrick is always going to go low and wide. You know, and central.
Yeah.
You know, a Kubrick composition. You know, it's going to be completely geometrical. It's going to be about a 14 millimeter, and it's going to be slightly below the eye line. And so you do sort of fall into a pattern. But at the same time, you have to remain completely open to seeing something. And much of the work that good directors do is done right on the spot. All of a sudden they see something. You walk in, and there you start blocking, and you have some ideas you've worked out. In fact, you may even have worked on some storyboards, but all of a sudden you see something. You know, so the actor walks this way, turns that way, no, wait a second, you know, something's happening here. And you cannot close yourself off to that. And so, I mean, that's the great danger of storyboarding, is that it starts to predict, you know, physical movement in a way that is not very creative.
Your films do tend to have like a set piece camera movement shot, though, be it like a long steady cam shot, a crane shot, and cat people going up and down through the...
Well, I mean, I think that's an expression of budget as well as anything else. You know, when you don't have all the toys, you know, when you have to pick and choose your toys, well, then you say, okay, we'll get this shot. We'll bring in a crane. It'll take a half day. This will be our big glory shot, and then we'll just clean it up afterward. If you have all the toys, you can do one shot like that after another all day long, and they don't quite stand out as much because the whole film is one kind of Spielbergian move after another. But when you can only afford to do one move like that a day, it stands out a bit more.
Which film would you say has the most kind of fluidity and set piece shots that you've done?
I think Comfort of Strangers.
Yeah. That was a film that you set out to be specifically an aesthetic film.
Yeah, that was to be, you know, a film of appearances in the way that Pinter writes about language. You know, it's the guys.
It was kind of following Light of Day, which didn't have that same kind of insistent look.
No, I think I made a mistake with Light of Day, and I think I tried to do it a little too far real. I mean, I was in a place where I was much more artificial, and then I backed up and tried to do something kind of kitchen sinky, and it didn't quite work because I really wasn't in a kitchen sink mindset, yet I was doing it, and I had some problems with the casting. I wasn't happy with that. So it was one of those films where you start to feel, and you're in the film, that it's just such an uphill grind. And of course, we all convince ourselves while we're working that it's going to work out. I mean, you can't go to work every day if you think it's not going to work out. So you can sell yourself almost anything. But there's always sort of part of you that's saying, you know, we're climbing uphill on this one, and maybe we'll pull it off, and maybe we won't.
Outside of Light of Day, is there any other film that defined the experience?
Well, I mean, I knew that. Oh yeah. I mean, I knew that I was in trouble with Forever Mine. I knew I was losing that battle. I knew I was in trouble with Woody on Walker. I knew that It wasn't what I wanted it to be. And then on other occasions, you just see that it's happening. Like with Affliction, I knew fairly early on that we were in the groove.
Yeah.
And it would take really something bad to throw us out of the groove. Everybody was in the groove. Whereas other films, you're not in the groove, you get in it, and you think, and boom, you're out of it again. But there is, there's something that feels right creatively in certain films, and a lot of it doesn't have to do with the comfort of the logistics. I mean, Canyons was a kind of a nightmarish experience, and just dealing with the financial reality and Lindsay's high maintenance world, but it always felt right. She and James felt right. If you could only get them in front of the camera, once you got them there, it worked. Whereas, I'd much rather have that problem than the other one, which is they're always there, and they all want to do take 10, but it's not working.
Yeah.
You don't know how to make it work. You do, and finally, in the end, it never really works. You just convince yourself it does.
Was everything clicking with American Gigolo? Because that's one that I always come back to. Not only it was a success.
I think so. I mean, that was, it was a piece of stylized, and it was looking forward into a kind of culture thing. I mean, Gear said to me afterward, because I had told him that, I said, I think there's a kind of new male narcissism in clothes that's coming, and getting away from this kind of Saturday Night Fever thing. And I ran to him a few years later, and he said, I never believed you when you would tell me that, but it turned out to be true. And so when you get into a kind of gestalt like that, when you sense we're in the curve, we're in the culture curve, then it's a good feeling, and actors feel it, and production people feel it. They feel like we're doing something interesting.
It's also a kind of marker for a lot of the themes that would come up in your films. There's the lonely man component. There's that Dante Beatrice obsession. How much of that is conscious when you're writing it? How much of it's just coming out because that's
both. When you're younger, there's a kind of adolescent, sophomoric desire to make it more conscious. And then you look back at that later and you say, ooh, you wince. He says, I didn't need to be that obvious. It's there. It is simply there. I was just trying to prove to my teachers and my professors how smart, what a good student I was. I should have just kept my mouth shut and, let them figure it out or not figure it out. But that desire for highbrow approval can get you in trouble. And particularly someone like myself who has a background in criticism and tends to be articulate. It's a bit problematic because so often the smartest thing is nothing. You just don't, like John Ford, you don't say a thing. And, they'll figure it out sooner or later. You don't need to help them figure it out. But, my generation, being a film school generation, is much more tempted, because the survival mechanism for a man like Ford is keep your mouth shut, and you'll survive. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and don't pretend you're doing anything other than making money. Whereas my generation, being the post-Nouvelle Vague, is sort of the opposite. Call attention to yourself, tell everybody what you're up to, tell them how important it is.
You've said that it's a film where the visuals finally caught up with the writing, like you were paying equal attention to them. What clicked on that one? What changed from, say, hardcore?
Oh, I mean, I began to understand visual logic.
Yeah.
The difference between illustrating and being. If you are not raised in a world of visual logic, you tend to illustrate, you know. So, so if you think beautiful sunset, then you go get a beautiful sunset. Well, that's an illustration. That's not really the thing itself. It's a marker for the thing. Hmm. What actually is a beautiful sunset, really? You know, it may not be a sunset at all. You know, and when you start to really think visually, you stop thinking about illustrations and you're thinking about the parade of images and the logic involved and what does it actually mean? What does that mean? When I put it next to this, what does that mean? And if I go back and forth, what is the third meaning of that? And it is not paper cup, glass cup. Those are words. What it is something about the iconography of these two images that speaks to visual logic. And it has not a lot to do with literary logic or verbal logic at all.
Is there like a key example of that in American Gigolo where it kind of clicked, where
you begin, you begin to see certain things compositionally. Like two films that really influenced Gigolo. One was obviously Conformist, but also L'Eclisse by Antonioni. And all of those shots where Antonioni is sort of behind the head and kind of drifting back and forth. And then the shots where people would be like this, and they would turn like this. And you start to see that, and you see that what Antonioni is talking about is not about character, but it's about form and shape as reflective of the visual emotion, what you're dealing with. You know, and so that when Monica Vitti looks at you this way and she turns ever so slightly, it's not the character that's doing that, it's the image that's doing that.
It's also a film where you have maybe pretty key collaborators. You had the art designer and the score.
Yeah. Part of the thinking of making Gigolo original in terms of Los Angeles, which is a greatly photographed town, was to bring in talents from Europe. So the production design came from Italy, and the music actually came from Italy, although it's Giorgio Moroder is Swiss, but he's from the Italian part of Switzerland. And so you're getting that kind of techno beat, which is a very European sound, and then those visuals, which is very European.
You have the same collaborators on Cat People, but it's a very different film. I mean, is that coming down to the script, the fact that it's a genre film?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the essential visual element of Gigolo is Los Angeles, and therefore kind of modernism, whereas the essential visual element of Cat People is New Orleans, and therefore a certain Victorianism, both in the zoo and in the streets and the architecture, and that starts to bleed through the film.
And Cat People didn't have that same success, though. Like, I'm curious, even now.
Well, I mean, actually, artistically, at this point, I think I would probably prefer Cat People.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It didn't, sort of catch on to the zeitgeist in that way. But I saw it again last fall. I really surprised how well it held up, especially in its analog, it's a pre-digital world of analog effects and all of that.
And it had a kind of provocative ending that maybe now that doesn't draw so much attention.
I think the ending would still be problematic.
Yeah? Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think it would be more problematic. I think we're well, certainly in movies we're more prudish now than we were then. You know, certain television is breaking free, and it's kind of ironic that shows like Girls and Game of Thrones are more outre than anything that you can put in a theater. And they're all NC-17 shows. You can't even do them in the theaters. But the notion, and I don't even know whether I would have been allowed to do it in a commercial film, because the original script, the monster is subdued and is burnt up in a burning building, you know, in a kind of conventional old dark house sort of way. And I said, wouldn't it be more interesting, rather than kill the monster, which he loves, that he make love to the monster and turn it into a shrine that he can keep in his zoo. Well, that still is a kind of kinky idea, because it not only involves forced sex, it also involves zoophilia and bondage and a kind of primitive animal cult religion, you know, and David Bowie sort of going off in this chant. We never previewed the film. It was interesting. And I remember when we opened in Westwood Village, and I went to an early screening, or a 7 o'clock screening. I went with Jerry Bruckheimer, who was the producer. And we were sitting in back, and there were 2 girls in front of us who were maybe 17 or so. And that ending came up. And one turned the other and simply went, "Oh my God." And I was sitting right in Jerry. I said to Jerry, I think we went too far. But I'm really glad we did.
Yeah.
And if we had previewed it, it would have. That's probably why we didn't preview it, because we didn't have another ending.
Yeah.
And you know, that was still a time when you could intimidate the studio a little more into getting your version.
But that was your last studio picture for a while, right?
My last studio picture ever.
Did it free you in a way to do Mishima? Is that something that you could even conceive
No.
of?
I mean, I moved on to Mishima because I had a disruption in my life, and all the life I had known sort of had come apart, and I left Los Angeles, and I had to kind of start over again. And one of the ways I started over was getting married, becoming a parent, and moving to Japan, and getting out of drugs. And when I got back from Japan, I realized that the industry had changed, and that the films I had been making were no longer being made by studios, and that the independent movement had begun.
And I mean, there's a really interesting financial backstory for how Mishima was made, right? Like, wasn't that a bit of a hustle getting the co-production?
Well, I mean, every film in a way has these tales, but Mishima knew the people who financed the movie, claimed they didn't finance it. I had a Japanese producer, Mata Yamamoto, and he had an anime company, and we had gotten involved in pre-production. He had spent about $1 million. And George Lucas and Francis Coppola had gotten Warner Brothers to match, and we had a commitment from Fuji Toa for 2.5, and then Warner's would match that. Well, when I started when the widow realized exactly what consultation rights meant, because I had led her to believe that, in fact, her opinion would be final, but in fact, all she had was consultation rights, and she wanted all references to homosexuality taken out, and I didn't do that. So then she turned on me, and she called up her friends in the old boy right-wing network, and then the guy from Fuji, went to Mata Yamamoto and said, we promised you $2.5 million. We will not be able to, live by this commitment. Now there is no paperwork in Japan, so it's all a matter of honor. And what Mata said essentially was, I put $1 million in this film. If you renege, if you go back on your word to me, I will become bankrupt, and at that point I will do what I have to do to make sure my children survive. Which in Japan was a kind of code language for, if I kill myself, my debts don't move on. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was at that time, that you could kind of clean up your debts for your children by committing suicide. So the guy from Fuji, he doesn't hear, oh, poor Mata is going to die. He hears, oh, fuck. If he kills himself because we lied to him, no one will ever do business with us again. And then I'm next. I'm going to have to go myself. And so several weeks later, he met with the Fuji people in Kamakura, and they gave him $2.5 million in a suitcase. Mm. And to this day, they claim they didn't. But, of course, it's never been shown in Japan because, in fact, Toho still has the rights, and they will not let it be shown, and they will not let it be, put out on DVD or anything. Mm. Although it's been widely distributed sub rosa. And when the film was at Cannes, Toho Towa had at their reception. I went to the reception, and I said to Kawakita, who's the head of it, and I said, I want to thank you for helping Mishima get made. And he looked me right in the eye and said, we had nothing to do with that film. And I said, well, thanks anyway. So that was a kind of peculiar situation, because Warner Brothers was only involved as a favor to George and Francis. As that they had angered George Lucas over THX, and this was a way to make up to George. So that's all they cared about, was buying a favor from George. So they didn't care about the film. Mm. So that was a $2.5 million favor they thought it was worth paying George for. The Japanese, they didn't invest either. So now I'm making this $5 million film, which is a 60-some day schedule, a big film, and nobody's paid for it. And also no one's going to see it, because it will never be shown in Japan, and it will be a foreign language film in the rest of the world. And Warner has no real interest in this film either. So I'm out there making a film that no one's paid for, that no one will see. And actually, rather than being free, that was a bit intimidating. Because normally, as a director, you always convince yourself that you're making compromises because you don't have a choice. You're saying, oh, we got to sell some tickets, so we're going to have to do this chase sequence here. But in fact, when you realize you're not going to sell any tickets, it means you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. And it's in fact more frightening, you say, because there's no kind of fallback excuse. Say, well, we got to show a little nudity here because people are going to want to see that. No. So, and also with that particular film, it was such a puzzle box of a film that there were very few of us, maybe 2 or 3 at the most, who actually understood what was going down. to everybody else, it was just a kaleidoscope of unrelated elements, you know, because there were so many different levels of reality we were doing simultaneously.
At one point, didn't someone on the crew say that if you died, no one would know how to make the film, put the film together?
No, I mean, someone on the crew did, but I thought that to myself. Because you always think when you're directing, gee, you know, if I got hit by a car, you know, you know, they could put this together. You know, we're close enough to the end now. And I remember I was directing, I think, geez, if I got hit by a car, I don't think anybody would know how to put this thing together.
You quoted Rossellini once, and it's something that I thought might have applied, which is that when you're dealing with someone's life, kind of biopic to a point, the only part you can invent is the structure. Was that kind of how you approached this? Like your fabrication being how you structure the...
Yeah. That, you know, human lives are not necessarily that dramatic. And most of the time, you go into history and you create a kind of phony dramatic arc in order to give a life, a narrative that it didn't have. In this case, I couldn't do anything that I couldn't prove. And so I realized that the originality, the creativity, is the assembly of the pieces rather than the distortion of the pieces. And so started coming up with this 4-part structure with 3 cross-hashed realities.
And it's a hugely ambitious venture, especially when you look at the art direction, the score. Were you aware of that at the time? How?
Well, it was exciting.
Yeah.
And you know, when you're doing something that you've not seen done before, it's not really that intimidating. It's just so exciting. I mean, in a way, it's more intimidating to do something that you've seen done a dozen times before. And you say, you know, well, we'll have to figure out in the editing some way to make this work. But, you know, when you're doing something that's kind of, you're just going, wow, that's cool, that's cool. You know, that is cool.
In a sense,
let's do another take. I just want to see that again.
In a sense, it's become kind of your canonized work. Is that something you're comfortable with?
Yeah, I think so, in a way, just because it is so one of a kind. You know, there's nothing quite like it, and yeah.
I want to talk about it in relation to Patty Hearst, because that's a film of yours that is kind of the opposite. It's kind of lapsed into oblivion. It's got a VHS. It's hard to see.
Yeah, I've been trying to get Criterion to fucking release that. Yeah.
It's got similar experimental tones to it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you know, again, now, when you talk about Patty Hearst, again, it's one of those situations where I got involved in the film because other people were intimidated by it. So, like, Come to Strangers, Schlesinger was going to do it, but Schlesinger didn't think he could pull it off. He dropped. Okay. Adam Resurrected, they tried to get a number of directors, and the director said, you can't do that. Lumet said, you can't make that work. Sidney Pollack said, you can't make that work. And I said, why not? You know, that's really interesting. Autofocus, you know, how can you make a film about this creepy guy? So, in Patty Hearst, the project came to me because they couldn't get a director. Because the directors were saying the first half of the movie takes place in a closet. How do I shoot a movie where the character is in a closet? You know, how do I dramatize that? And I read it and I said, wait a second. If she's in the closet and she's blindfolded, that means that all she really knows of reality is what she imagines it to be. And therefore, for the first half of the movie, there are no restrictions on reality. You just go into her imagination and recreate an equivalent reality. It doesn't have to be the real reality at all. And for that reason, the first half of the movie is actually very interesting. The second half, once she gets out of the closet, it becomes less interesting because then you're kind of stuck in the actual reality of the world rather than the reality of a frightened, paranoid prisoner.
Now, at this point, you're starting to move. You mentioned Comfort of Strangers. You're moving into more adaptations, and I'm curious how you approach something like Elmore Leonard in Touch, or Pinter / McEwen in Comfort of Strangers.
You know, I mean, you know, very few. I'm trying to think if there's the only adaptation that I put together myself was Affliction, and I found that book. I contacted Russell Banks, got the rights, wrote the script, put the film together. The others, whether it be Pinter or Leonard, were projects that were out there, that were having trouble getting a director because of what was perceived to be the difficulty or the uncommerciality of the material, and it's like, well, it's like Ehud Bleiberg, who produced Adam Resurrected. He told me that they had gone out with the script to a number of the usual candidates: Barry Levinson, Mark Rydell, Lumet, and Pollock, and they all had turned it down. Said, "You can't do this. You can't. The man, the dog. It doesn't work." And he said that he was meeting with ICM, who represented me at the time, and he said to them, "Well, don't you have any clients who aren't afraid of doing something?" And Jeff Berg said to him, "Well, you know, Schrader, he'll do almost anything." and he said, "You should send it to him. You know, he'll probably do it." And when I read it, all I thought was, wow, this is really invigorating. I didn't think, you know, this won't make a dime and this will be a career killer. Because if I had thought like that, I wouldn't have made half the films I ever made. I mean, I knew Mishima wasn't going to make. I had this conversation once with Sidney Pollack, because we were talking about something, and Sidney says, you know, he had this company, Mirage, at the time, and he said, you know, the young filmmakers come in here, and they regard me as old and square, but I see them and I think that I'm not really that different from them. He said, do you really feel that you're different from me, you know, in that way? And I said, well, Sidney, I had made 2 films that I knew before Principal began would lose money. And in both cases, I thought it was worth it to do it, whatever the career repercussions. I said, would you do that? And he smiled. He said, no, he said, I would never do that. If I knew a film was going to lose money before I started, I wouldn't start.
What were the 2 films?
Mishima and Patty Hearst.
Patty Hearst, yeah.
I knew in both cases that they were doomed.
But going back to the adaptation point, I thought it's interesting that you mentioned Adam Resurrected. It seems like you were kind of challenged, like there was a bet, like could you even pull this off? And it's kind of how we were describing Affliction, that you wrote and you handled it, whereas it seems like Touch and Comfort of Strangers, maybe they don't add up in the same way that those other 2 films do.
Well, I mean, now Russell Banks' sensibility is very, very close to mine, and in a way I was doing myself when I was doing Russell.
Yeah.
Dutch Leonard, Harold Pinter, that's a different sensibility, and I'm trying to get into their groove. And in the same way I get into Bret Easton Ellis' groove. So, yeah, it's a little different in that way. Because you're trying to knock off Leonard, and other people have done it. Just about everybody's done it, and very few have done it successfully. And I guess I'm one of those who hasn't done it successfully. Although a lot of that has just to do with the material, because that's the only book Leonard ever wrote that didn't make money. So it was kind of doomed from the beginning. But Leonard is hard to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there must be a dozen or more Leonard films. There's only one or two that are really good.
What are the ones you like?
Well, Get Shorty.
Yeah.
And the one that Quentin did, they changed the title.
Jackie Brown?
It's called Jackie Brown, yeah.
Rum Punch.
Rum Punch, yeah. And yeah, that's about it, really.
I'm always surprised that Light Sleeper resonated as much as it did. It's a really great film, but I'm curious how did you approach that film? It was coming off of, you had just finished Comfort of Strangers, or?
I'm not quite sure. That was a script I had written, one I really felt strongly about. Mm. That was a film that I ended up putting $250,000 into, which was all the money, disposable money I had at that time. Because we ran short. We were in pre-production, and it looked like we were 2 to 3 weeks away from a deal. Well, once you stop pre-production, everything stops. Mm. So I just kept funding pre-production, and fortunately, the deal came through, and I got my money back, and we continued on. So I mean, obviously, I felt very, very strongly in making that film.
At what point did the lonely man concept become crystallized in your mind?
Well, I mean, from the beginning, it was the guy in the back seat. So the taxi driver was in the front seat. Now this character's in the back seat, and he's being driven around. So you're moving from an active to a passive character, and that was essential to the idea. You're moving from an angry young man who's trying to make the world fit his fantasies to a middle-aged guy who feels there's no place for him left. Mm. So it's a real front seat, back seat kind of situation, both in New York City, but different point of view.
And were you reflecting on your own life at that point? Because you used to write at night, you used to kind of lead that nocturnal existence that like American Gigolo had, or Taxi Driver, and the Willem Dafoe.
And also, there's a lot of it was about the drug culture.
Yeah.
And about people I knew in that world. I've told this story before, I'll tell it again. It was the only script that came to me in a dream, which is I had been thinking about doing a midlife movie. A movie about somebody who's about 40. And I couldn't get the idea. I went through a lot of cliches, and the guy who quits his job, and the professor who runs off with a student, and the guy who decides to become a race car driver, whatever. And it just wasn't doing it. And I started giving up the search for the midlife metaphor. And then I was dreaming one night, and in the dream, this drug dealer that I had known, John, came. We were talking, and he was uncomfortably close. His face was really right in mine in the dream. And I woke up abruptly because he had invaded my dream space. I said, wow, was that vivid. Whew! I hadn't thought about him in a couple of years, and he was right there. What were we talking about in the dream? And I realized that he was asking me about the movies. He asked me if any movies I had seen, what I liked. I said, yeah, well, that's right. He's my guy. I couldn't find him, so he finally came into my dream life and found me. The 40-year-old drug delivery boy whose boss who is going to quit, and he has no skills and needs to find another job. That's a midlife crisis that I can really get behind. Now, there's a true midlife crisis, a very original one. And so I got up from bed and went in my office and started making notes to myself. And by the end of the day, I picked up the phone and started calling around, and I found this guy. He was still working, and I went over and met with his boss, Cynthia. They were both still working at that time. And I went over and I met with them, and we talked to them. I said, I want to do this movie about you, write this script about you. And then then I started going on rounds with John, just sort of researching it, and it all came quite quickly. And but Cynthia was still, she was a little, do we really want you to do this movie about us? And then she called me up a few days later and said, that I was talking to Michael White. And Michael White, I said, I talked to Michael White and I talked to Bernardo Berlucci. And they both said, you're okay, so okay. And so that's how that happened.
Was Willem Dafoe's character named after Bruno Latour? That's something that I've always wondered.
No, it was just after traveling. It was a way, a drifter.
Yeah.
Somebody who's on the tour. Because I mean, there's a painter, George Latour.
Yeah.
And people have said that, but no, it was just a name that was evocative of drifting. Just like Travis is traveler, tour is a tourist.
Yeah. The reason I thought of it is because of this actor network theory where it's like he's someone that's traversing between all of these people, and it's something that kind of resonates with the conspiracy or the mystery stories that tend to go with these, like American Gigolo. And I'm wondering why you drift towards that story when you're dealing with these types of characters.
Well, it gets down to this, what I call this monocular vision, which is when you have a character who is slightly disreputable or not, has a conventional approval rating, a drug dealer, a gigolo, a psychopath. There's going to be a resistance for viewers to empathize. And one of the ways you get around that is you close off the other eye so that you only see the world through one eye, and your character's eye. So any other reality doesn't exist. And if you can make that world interesting enough, long enough, associations will start to develop. And people will start to empathize, understand the character, and then you can get somewhere. But what that means is that you can't have external points of view. Every single scene has to be, here he is, he goes here, he looks 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 here. You can't step back and say, there he is, from an objective lens. Because you see him from an objective lens, you say, what a creep. So you have to stay inside the monocular eye line.
Were you intending to kind of close this story off with the Walker? Was that meant to be like a kind of coda to?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I am going to do an older guy now, but I mean, not this guy. And also, I made a joke to somebody once. I said, well, maybe I should do one more about a guy who runs an elevator. I take him up, I take him down, doesn't matter to me. But it's, it's harder and harder to find interesting drifting occupations for senior citizens.
And it's a film that it looks different than any other of your films. It has way more handheld stuff. It kind of has a European co-pro look. Like, were those choices you were deliberately making?
I mean, film style has been changing, and so that was a post-shaky cam movie.
Yeah.
And some of that we did doing bungee long lens, I mean, I had developed a very kind of classical style But you know, that's all gone now, and there is no classical style anymore. You know, anything goes. Editing wise, lighting wise, camera wise, you can put anything you want next to each other. One of the things I realized when shooting canyons, I was trying to find a style. And I said, wait a second, there is no style anymore. And this guy from Montreal, this young kid, Xavier De Luna, had made this film Heartbeats. And I liked the film, and I looked at it again, and I realized, I said, he's going from scene to scene, changing his style based on the scene. He did a Godardian thing, and now he's doing a Hollywood thing, and now he's doing a kind of Bertolucci thing. And now he's doing a pseudo-doc thing. He keeps changing, and he doesn't really care that one scene doesn't match the scene before it. And I said, there's nothing wrong with it. That's where we are. That's the new kind of style. You don't. So if you can do one scene, complete mise-en-scène, dolly to dolly, and do the very next scene, handheld, multi-gun, and put them right next to each other, and nobody cares anymore.
And that's what you've done with canyons.
Yeah, I mean, there's a, there's a Bertolucci scene followed by a Cassavetes scene.
It seems like it's a self-reflexive film. Like, are you finding that your films are getting a bit more? Like, I found that with Adam Resurrected. Maybe it's the black and white. Maybe it's the period, like the flashbacks.
I don't. No. I mean, it could be there, but particularly with canyons, I was really trying to get into Bret's world, and and James and Lindsay's world, and not try to get them into my world.
Have you thought about with this new Nick Cage one how you're going to shoot it? At what point does that enter into the equation?
Well, I've been thinking about it. I just looked at this movie Primer.
Yeah.
All that long lens stuff, completely backed off. I'm starting to think, maybe I said that. So I bought the DVD and said, look at this, keep this DVD around. Look at this stuff, because everything is 200, 250. And normally I've always shot right here, But maybe I said, maybe this one shoot in the back. Because I'm much more interested in films that adapt themselves to their material, rather than have this kind of, this is what Hitchcock does, and therefore it looks like this. To me, the great film genius of Kubrick is the fact that he seemed to be able to reinvent himself visually. Granted, there are certain things he always did, but he comes up with Barry Lyndon. That's a different world, so that idea of a fungible film style I find more interesting. Although, of course, film critics love it when somebody locks themselves in a cage and you say, oh, that's Hawks. Hawks would do that shot.
Yeah, do you think that that's going to affect or has affected your reception, like the auteurist studies that tend to privilege that?
Not really. I do think that if I, over the years, had kept my mouth shut a little more, it probably would have helped. I don't think I did myself any favors by telling people what I was up to. Just like this current film, Beyond the Pines. This guy, how do you pronounce his name? Chiam-Franca?
Yeah.
Whoever. I was reading some interviews again, and I said, oh, boy, you should just shut up. You should just shut up, because it's a very ambitious film, it's a very pretentious film. Just shut up and, go to default mode and say, well, I was just trying to tell a story. I was just trying to make some money. I didn't know I was doing anything of value. You know, that famous John Ford interview with Bogdanovich.
Yeah. But then again, the critic turned filmmaker is a myth that people like.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Oh, okay. Great.